All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Monday morning. Apologies for a Monday morning webinar, but I think you're going to find this quite engaging and enjoy the 2 hours that we're going to be spending together. My name is Jen Weiss. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University, and I'm just thrilled to be a partner with the South Carolina Energy Office to facilitate this electric vehicle stakeholder initiative project that we've been doing together since the beginning of 2021 and will continue on through the end of 2021. Thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. Thank you for being a part of the stakeholder initiative. We've had a couple of workshops already that I know many of you have participated in, and hoping that even more of you will want to get involved with us. So thank you. Just a couple of logistical items real quickly. And some of you have already asked, the webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending out the link towards the end of this week. Please make sure that your lines are muted. We should have about 80 people or more on the call today. So please make sure that you keep your lines muted unless you're asking a question. And then for questions, we prefer that you use the chat function to ask questions. But if you need to have a clarifying follow-up to a question, please feel free to take yourself off of mute. So welcome again to the Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative. As I said, this is something we've been doing in partnership with the Energy Office since the beginning of the year. And the objectives of this initiative are threefold. One is to examine the legislative and regulatory environment today for EVs and EV charging station across the state. Start to work together to identify challenges and opportunities for EVs and EV charging stations, and then develop a set of recommendations to increase EV penetration and EV charging stations in South Carolina. And so the workshops that we have done so far and the working groups that have kicked off have really started to dig right into all of this. And then one of the things that we found as we were talking about EVs in South Carolina is that there was a need for a little bit additional information and to learn more about the landscape about EV infrastructure. It was the #1 question we received coming out of the workshops. And so we decided today to put together this panel, this webinar of subject matter experts that do this every day, that can come and talk to us a little bit more about EV infrastructure and what it means. And so I've broken up today's webinar into a couple different parts. For the first part, Catherine Reed and Ben Kessler from the Energy Office and within the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff will give you a kind of a background of the initiative and what is already being done within the Energy Office for electrification. Then we're going to move into a technology discussion. Dale Hill from Proterra will give us a little bit of a deeper dive into different charging levels and standards, just to kind of give us a flavor of what's out there today. And then we'll turn to Kevin Miller from ChargePoint, Josh Cohen from Greenlots, and Jim Polk from Duke Energy to give us some insight into the planning and permitting and installation of EV charging infrastructure. What does it look like? What are we doing today? Then we're going to switch gears a little bit and dive into some infrastructure use cases. So we've got 4 great guests that have actually started to implement EV infrastructure or are looking at it to give us a feel for what it's like within their organizations and some of the challenges that they've had and some of the solutions that they've seen, and just give us a feel for what it takes. So for the public transit perspective, we have James Keel from the city of Greenville. For fleet electrification, we have Jim O'Leary from NFI Industries. For workplace charging, we are joined by Christy Fortin from Continental Tire. And for the multifamily perspective, we have Duncan Cannon from Cortland. So this is going to be a really good opportunity for you to hear some great use case stories. Then we'll move over a little bit to regional context. Stan Cross, always able to give us a really good perspective on what's going on across the region, will join us and help to give us that landscape. And then Stan will facilitate a little discussion Q&A at the end. We promise to get you wrapped up by 12 o'clock, so you can all go grab your lunch. So that said, I am going to turn it right over to Catherine and Ben.
Thank you so much, Jen. As Jen said, I'm Catherine Reed. I'm the Deputy Director of the South Carolina Energy Office within the Office of Regulatory Staff. Really happy to see all of you in attendance for this first of our educational webinars as part of this electric vehicle stakeholder initiative. I thought Jen gave a really great overview of both the initiative as well as what we plan to accomplish today. But before we dive into the the meat of the discussion, I thought it would be helpful to provide some additional background and context for these discussions, especially for those of you who might be somewhat new to these meetings with us. We've had, as Jen mentioned, kicked off our electric vehicle stakeholder initiative at the beginning of the calendar year, but not all of you have been a part of it. So I wanted to just to provide a little more background. If you could advance the slide, please. And just for context, so we are the Energy Office within the Office of the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. I wanted to point out that as the name implies, the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff is a regulatory body. However, we or get involved in regulatory matters. However, the Energy Office is explicitly non-regulatory. So there is sort of a firewall between what we do and what ORS does in terms of regulatory matters. We are funded through the U.S. Department of Energy's State Energy Program. Many of you will know that every state and territory of the United States has a state energy program that is funded through a formula grant that comes from the Department of Energy. And our mission is to focus on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean transportation through various programs that we administer, in addition to energy planning. So this is an example of the energy planning work that we are involved in. Another initiative within our office of the Energy Office is the Palmetto Clean Fuels Coalition. This is also funded through the U.S. Department of Energy, but this one through the Clean Cities program. And the goal of the Clean Cities program is to promote alternative fuels and infrastructure. So we have sort of that added component, and Ben Kessler serves as our coordinator of that initiative. Next, please. So just in case that was a lot of words, you can just see here, here's the state. The Office of Regulatory Staff is the agency in which we are located. The Energy Office, and then you can see where the funding comes from the U.S. Department of Energy and Clean Fuel. So we're supported through the state as well as through the federal government. Next, please. So I really wanted just to let you all know how we got here to this discussion today. Sorry, I muted myself. And so basically how we got here could be summarized through this slide right here. In 2019, Duke Energy filed for an electrification pilot with the Public Service Commission, which at that point prompted the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff to hold a stakeholder meeting to discuss. And when that happened, it was clear that there was a need for a much broader discussion, because of course, that particular stakeholder meeting was really just focused on the subject of Duke Energy's proposed pilot. And people came out of the woodwork wanting to have a broader statewide discussion of these topics. So this is sort of what came out of that was this recognition that there was a need for something like what we're doing today. So that's where the idea came for the Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative. In preparation for it, as Jen mentioned, we launched at the beginning of this calendar year, but in preparation for it, the Energy Office completed a review of the electric vehicle infrastructure and basically the registration data, incentives, and policies. And so we have a baseline assessment that was conducted in 2016, and building upon that, in the last 2 years, we've worked to update that information. So we do have that information available. However, I would say that even though we updated it, I think by the end of 2020, so much has changed, and there's so much continues to change. So it's an ever evolving assessment, but it's a good overview of sort of what's been in the past. Another thing we did was kick off a stakeholder survey, sort of in the middle of COVID, actually. We reached out to our broad stakeholder network throughout the state and basically conducted a survey on SurveyMonkey to try to get feedback on issues of electric vehicle adoption, infrastructure, incentives, barriers and challenges and opportunities, and the education and outreach issues surrounding electric vehicles. And it was a really successful survey. We received 111 responses, which was pretty remarkable. And and we have the information also available if anyone is interested. Before I hand it off to my colleague Ben Kessler, I do want to just identify a few additional items. A very hot off the press development. Most of you probably know, if you're on this call, you probably already know this. But Senate Bill 304 passed last week in our General Assembly. And it basically changes the definition of a public utility. So it exempts an electric vehicle charging station from being considered a public utility. So that's a big step forward for the state in terms of taking down one of the challenges to broader electric vehicle penetration in the state. Another thing that I think is incredibly significant for this particular group is that that particular legislation calls for the formation of a joint committee of electrification of transportation. And what is great about that is not only does it create a forum within the General Assembly to look at this, it actually calls out specifically that the electric vehicle stakeholder initiative that we are doing be reported to them. So I think what's fantastic, I mean, for those of you who've ever been involved in planning exercises, you can have a really great plan, but if it doesn't have the right audience, it'll just sit on a shelf. And you might be, so this is a really exciting thing to know that the work we're doing today and continue to work over this next year will really have a forum among decision makers who can move things forward. So we're really excited about that. That's kind of an oversimplification of it, but those are the two highlights, I think, from that legislation. And then one more thing in terms of broader context, our state energy office has been working with our peers, other energy offices throughout the Southeast on a Southeastern Regional Electric Vehicle Information Exchange. And what that is, it's a fancy long word to basically say that we're all working together as a region to try to plan for electric vehicle infrastructure. And we're working on mapping, and we're working on just communicating with one another, recognizing that transportation doesn't end at the state boundaries. So the idea is to work together to share information, identify best practices. So we're really excited. We're reporting, of course, to them what we're doing here in our state, and we're learning from what the other states are doing to help inform our process. So I just wanted to let you know, and just for context, the National Association of State Energy Officials and the Duke University Nichols Institute are working to help coordinate that effort, and we're really excited. So I guess that is my big picture overview of the context. I'd like to pass it on to Ben Kessler, our Clean Transportation Specialist in the Energy Office. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for the intro too. So hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Ben Kessler. I'm going to walk you through some of the stuff that we've been doing, where's it been done, and why folks are doing it. And then I'll be passing it back. Well, actually also about funding opportunities that are currently available. So just to get right into it, some of the things that we've done from the Energy Office are really kind of centered around this, this initiative of lead by example, which came out of our state energy plan. So just stemming through this, it really pushes state agencies and local governments to lead by example in terms of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean transportation. So stemming from this, we purchased our first state agency electric vehicle. Thank you to State Fleet Management for the help through that process. So we're using this as a case study for other agencies, kind of as a catalyst for the state to further these discussions. And it's led to some really great partnerships, such as with Plug-in SC through the SCPRT, deploying stations at their state parks. You may have saw that in the news. So that was a really great effort through our two agencies. Additionally, not directly tied to this, but kind of coming through those efforts is what we're doing here, the Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative. So another thing we've been working on is Plug-in SC. This was a marketing program that Landon Masters, one of our previous coordinators, had developed. It is to create a uniform experience for electric vehicle users as well as motorists to identify stations, to see where they're at, and know that they're there. Sometimes they can be kind of tucked away and folks don't know. So we're trying to make them bright and beautiful. There is an incentive program for this. We'll fund the signage, the blue EV sign and the no parking sign. So if you do have a public charging station, we can provide those at no cost to you. And then something I'll talk a little bit more in a bit is the alternative fuel corridors. This was part of a US DOT action in 2016, stemming from the FAST Act, the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. And we were actually the first state in the Southeast and actually the first state in the nation to place alternative fuel corridor identification signage along our interstate. So that's pretty neat for us. I'm going to move over to infrastructure. Where is it at right now? So this data is pulled from the Alternative Fuel Data Center, which is run by the U.S. Department of Energy. I will say these aren't all the stations out there. This is a crowdsourced number, but from what we know and what we see on the ground. So as of May 13th, we know that there are about 323 public stations in South Carolina with 701 public charging outlets. As you can see, most of this is centered around the urban areas where electric vehicle market penetration is much higher than some of the rural areas. This map also is not including Tesla stations, though I did put Tesla on here. I will note that for our perspective from the Energy Office and the U.S. Department of Energy, we do not include Tesla because it is a proprietary technology and that folks who do not have Teslas cannot use it. So I'm going to focus now on the alternative fuel corridors that I talked about and how folks are traveling around our state in terms of logistics, freight, and tourism. So for a corridor to be there's two designations. It can be pending or ready. So to be a ready corridor through the Federal Highways Administration, it needs to be a public station. It needs to have a CHAdeMO and a CCS connector that I know Dale will get into. The stations need to be less than 50 miles apart, and they need to be less than 5 miles from the corridor. So this map here, and might look a little confusing at first, but just see the connected purple blotches mean that that corridor is ready. So here in South Carolina, basically our only fully ready corridor is 85 through the upstate. So props to the developers and station hosts up there. We are certainly doing some good work throughout the rest of the state. As you can see, maybe only one station might need to be put down per interstate portion here to connect it through the whole state. So we're doing a good job. I would say that, you know, some of the major corridors such as 95, which are really big logistics corridors, should be, and our evacuation routes need to definitely have some focus put on them moving forward. And we're certainly doing that. But we are doing a good job. We're actually updating our signs through the round 5 refresh from the US DOT. This was an action to look back on our stations to make sure that we're still meeting that criteria. And through that process, we actually found a couple more designations. So a little bit around Columbia will be extended on the 26 corridor and the North Charleston corridor. And this map was created in coordination with the Center for Transportation and Environment. We got some grant funding through the what is called CFDIP, is the Southeast Alternative Fuel Deployment Partnership. So we did this with Georgia, North Carolina, and ourselves. So this was a good planning experience for us and helps us identify where locations need to go. So I'm going to turn over to a project that we did during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. As some of y'all know, as the stimulus recovery. I was actually in 9th grade at this time, so this predates me. But we did receive $480,000 through the U.S. Department of Energy. This came through our Palmetto Clean Fuels or Clean Cities grant and through the U.S. Department of Energy State Energy Programming. And through this funding, we were able to fund 80 stations around South Carolina. Many of these went up at city locations, parking garages, parking lots, retail locations, destination locations, and many of them are still in service today. And actually drivers are using them every day. We learned some lessons though from it. These stations are not supported by the OEM anymore. They dropped their mobility product line, which really leaves us kind of in a bind when folks reach out with problems on these stations that really, unfortunately for us, our best answer is that sometimes you might have to go with another company because that one's not being supported anymore. So that was a big lesson for us. And then these are dummy chargers. You know, they're not smart connected to the internet, so we can't pull data from them. So certainly that was a lesson learned from us as the technology develops and as we move forward with new station deployments that will probably move forward with smart chargers like we did at SCPRT locations at the state parks. And then next slide. So I just wanted to go over, I know some folks will touch on this, but why do folks install electric vehicle supply equipment? One of the big things that we've seen from small towns, rural towns, is that, you know, it attracts folks to come there. These pictures we can see, I'm going to move from left to right, but we have City of Aiken. They just installed a Gen 3 Siemens charger. On the right here, we have City of Rock Hill with their Chevy Volt. They have 2 Eden chargers. City of Greenville here on the bottom left, they have about 27 Clipper Creek chargers now in their parking garages. And then on the right here is another Gen 3 Siemens charger that the City of Newberry just installed right next to their Opera House and Main Street. So certainly encourage everyone to go check these out. They're really cool. They're located next to amenities. So get a free charge and check out the city, which leads me to the next point, economic development. So co-locating these near to retail locations to attract folks in and grow that tax base is definitely something we've seen. And sustainability. So encouraging not only environmental sustainability, but economic and social sustainability and attracting and retaining talent. And then some folks are also doing revenue generation, right? Right now as a state, it's certainly on the floor, right? Changing from kilowatt hour to parking time. But as right now, folks are charging parking fees to recoup some of those energy costs. So these are all really great reasons that we've seen cities and private folks installing chargers. And we'll probably start see more as time goes on. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to make you all aware of some funding opportunities out there for electric vehicles, just since we have everyone here. So the Energy Office does offer up to $10,000 for high impact, high visibility projects. This is competitive funding, but it does open up in July. So if you're thinking about hosting a public charging station, this is a really great resource to take advantage of. Additionally, the Energy Office Concert Fund loan. If you're an entity who's also looking to get vehicles and chargers, this is a great way to do it. It's a really low interest rate. You use the payback of the savings from the project to pay your loan. Additionally, the US DOT, through an FY21 appropriations bill memo, they have changed the highway infrastructure program that funding can be used, 80 to 100% can cover charging installation along corridors. So about $10.8 million was allocated to South Carolina in that appropriations bill. So that is something that local MPOs and the state DOT can take advantage of. And then if you're looking for vehicles, the EPA DARA program is a great thing to take advantage of, can fund up to 60% of that vehicle cost. And of course, always open DOE funding opportunities, and we can help you all put together a concept paper, grant, whatever it may be to help you figure that out. And the next slide, I think that's it. So yep, that's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. And I think I'll be passing back to Jen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben and Catherine, for all that great background information to get us really thinking, get the juices going this morning for EV infrastructure. And thank you both for all you do. So I am now going to step aside and turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Stan Cross, to kind of be the master of ceremonies for the rest of this discussion. So Stan Cross is from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and take it away, Stan.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everybody. Great to be here today. I have the honor of moderating our infrastructure technology discussion. So we're going to be hearing from a number of experts in the space. We're going to start with Dale Hill from Proterra, who's going to spend 10 to 15 minutes talking about charging infrastructure. Proterra, as many of you know, is based up in the Greenville, South Carolina area, and has been a leader in both bus manufacturing as well as charging infrastructure manufacturing and deployment. And then we'll hear from Kevin Miller, Josh from ChargePoint, Josh Cohen from Greenlots, and Jim Polk from Duke Energy. And we'll talk a little bit about charging infrastructure from their perspectives as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. And Dale Hill, if you'll go ahead and give us a little 101 on charging infrastructure, that'll be great.
You know, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for the honor of being a part of this discussion. Anyway, as most of you know, Proterra is the one that started a paradigm shift in the transit industry worldwide from diesel to battery electric. When you are the leader, then you have to you have to explore all the different interrelated fields to the product you're selling. And it's kind of like the insurance commercial where we've learned a thing or two because we've done a lot of things. We've seen a lot of things that didn't work out right. But anyway, as a result, if you could go to the next slide, as we developed our bus, we found out that in the past, diesel vehicle manufacturers just built the vehicle. As an electric vehicle provider, we now had to sell the filling station that went with it, which was a whole new field to the incumbent vehicle manufacturers. And so we developed two new divisions. One is our Proterra Energy division. In that division, we have our own set of experts, the engineering team. We'll come in and first of all do a when a customer first starts talking about an installation, we'll do a infrastructure assessment, what all would be correct, and we would meet with the utility company, find out what power is available. And then we have our own engineering team to do the engineering for that infrastructure. And the biggest thing that we encourage customers to do, if you are going to start off with 3 to 5 vehicles, but plan to go to 20 to 50 vehicles, put the infrastructure in to handle the 20 vehicles in the very beginning, so you don't tear up the concrete, put in conduit, but you have to turn around a year later and come back and tear out and put larger in. And then we do we develop the energy management infrastructure that I'll talk about later, the advanced energy storage. So where we can put in solar and store the energy using second life batteries. In the early stages, it may be new batteries, but the ability to use second life. And then we've had to develop our own finance department where we can not only finance or lease buses, but finance the infrastructure and the everything that goes with that. We have the ability to do that, as well as the charging equipment. So it becomes a very, very, what started off as one slice of pizza turned out into a whole pizza pie, so to speak. Next slide, please. This shows some of our installations. We, on the left, you see a solar installation that we are in the process of doing, where we're putting solar over overhead charge stations for multiple charging. In the center there is a $80 million facility that Edmonton, Canada installed for storing their buses inside. It's very cold there in the wintertime. 40 below zero is not uncommon. And those are pantograph chargers that come down and charge each bus. On the right, it looks like Jacksonville, Wyoming, where the chargers, with our chargers, we have custom built for us by Power Electronics, a complete family of chargers that I'll talk about in a minute, and the pedestals to go with those chargers. Our chargers can be mounted up to 500 feet away from the charge pedestal. And so that's just showing a number of installations we've done. Next. And currently we have like 45, 50 megawatts of installation we charged, and 450 or so charge stations located around North America. I was asked to show what was done for charging in the transit industry. The industry is standardized for plug-in charging on J1772 CCS1, which is what you see on the left. In the automotive industry, that's interchangeable with most cars that are out there. I think Chatamo is the other one that's used, and that's only by 1 or 2 manufacturers. Tesla, of course, has their own unique charge technology that they use. Next. This shows the plug that is common in the transit industry, and as the transit industry forged the path west, we've seen school buses. We've now delivered over 50 school buses. We see them using the same plug, and so that is pretty much the industry standard. For large fleet deployments, so you do not want to rely on an individual to plug in, but you go to overhead charging, and that's J3105. Next. This shows some J3105 installation. Once again, the indoor installation that I showed you earlier on Edmonton. The one on the right is Chicago. This is out on the west side of Chicago, the main drag going through Chicago out to Navy Pier. The route runs from the western low-income area through town and winds up at Navy Pier out on the east side of town. They run these buses from like 5 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the morning. And the standard bus is good for 150 to 175 miles. They have installed pantograph chargers so that they can do a quick charge to give them a little extra energy on their very long routes. I would point out that we, this last year, introduced our new extended range bus with 670 some kilowatt hours of energy. That has a range of 250 to 300 miles, and that covers 99% of all transit routes. Next. So we developed our own line of chargers, as I said, working with Power Electronics, which is the largest charger manufacturer in the world. They are US manufactured in Arizona. They're highly reliable, they're compact, they're cost effective, they're high power. Next. And so we have a whole family of chargers. As I said, the charger itself could be located 500 feet away from the pendant. The pendants have 2 charge cables, allowing you to do multiple charge applications. We build our chargers in 75 kilowatt modules. That's going to be upgraded here very shortly. But a 75 kilowatt charger can charge 1 bus at a time and then sequentially change that to the next charger. The 150 kilowatt can do likewise, or it could support 2 charge pendants with each having 2 outlets. And you see the multiples here, and you see the pantograph chargers. Just about 6 to 8 months ago, we introduced our new 1.5 megawatt charger. That charger can charge up to 20 buses at one time and 40 buses sequentially. I would point out that is, and I'll talk about this later, is a V2G adaptable charge system, and that's going to be kind of open a whole new door in the charging industry. Next. That's just giving you a little bit more. We can charge 10 buses at 150 kilowatts. You can charge 20 at 75, or you can do combinations of pantographs, and depending on what your particular application is. And as I said, when we start talking to a customer, first of all, we won't even take an order unless we have sat down, first of all, with the utility company to determine what power is available and what we would need to do as far as we design the system. The 150 or the 1.5 megawatt charger, you're able to bring the power in, primary power in without a step down transformer. You can bring in 15,000 volts and it will translate that into the needed output power you have without using a step down transformer. Next. This is showing our installation in our factory in Greenville. Once again, because it saves space, it saves money, it saves everything related to installation if you put a 1.5 megawatt charger in. And all the modules are 75 kilowatt modules. They're all redundant, so if one module goes out, it'll automatically switch to the other remaining modules and keep you going. Go ahead to the next. We're going to skip over here. Keep moving. That's just showing what you can do. Middle is the amount of time for the different applications. Our standard bus is 440 kilowatt, which is your middle line there. But a standard 150 kilowatt charger will recharge a bus in less than 3 hours. Next. And for school buses, we can use a 75 kilowatt charger, and we can put 4 modules, the pedestals on that, because the school bus only runs about 50 miles a day, and we can program that to charge sequentially as they need to be charged. Next. Keep moving here. I'm going to run out of time. Keep going. We do meet all the required different specifications required in this family of charger. Let's talk about V2G for a minute. About 12 years ago, I met with school districts in Colorado, and I told them that electric school buses would never be a financially viable option until utility companies realized that 100 school buses plugged into the grid in peak hours and during the summertime when they're not being used is equivalent to a 22 megawatt peaking station. And if they took the money for a peaking station, use that to buy school buses, then they would use that money to solve two problems. And lo and behold, a year or so ago, Dominion Energy realized that, and they purchased 50 school buses, which have been, most of those have been delivered, I believe now. And they're doing an experiment with V2G and school buses. And I think you're going to see that become a big factor in the future. Other states seeing this and other utilities seeing this are starting to pick upon this model. Next. So you can see a complete microgrid developing here where we use solar, second life batteries store that energy used to offset your peak demand charges, and those chargers then used to charge multiple buses in different combinations. Next. And so when you get all this done, we found that we had to develop a cloud-based monitoring system so that you could tell where the buses are, how much energy they're going to need each night, when those buses, that fleet of buses, you could turn the individual buses on and off, where the energy was coming from, where it was going to be stored, how much was stored, the maintenance required for those vehicles you can see, and the ability to plug in or connect multiple vendors' buses into that same system. To control all of that required a very sophisticated cloud-based control system, which we developed called Apex. We've had very good success with this in Edmonton, and we are continuing to upgrade this system as we learn more and learn what all is required, learn what we can and can't do with the system. So what we've learned in the transit industry from day one is going to be translatable into first school bus fleets and then into trucking fleets, delivery van fleets as they come available and start to enter the market. And so with that, that's a brief overview of what's coming in the charging market. And with that, I'm through.
Thank you, Dale. Really appreciate the insights, and I think it's really informative to see, you know, what's happening on the cutting edge of charging when we were looking at these medium and heavy duty vehicles. And I think not only is there transferability to those medium and heavy duty vehicles, but also to the challenges that light duty vehicles are experiencing as well. And so with that, I'd love to sort of transition us to talk with Kevin Miller from ChargePoint and Josh Cohen from Greenlots to get a perspective on EV charging from the charging service providers, as well as Jim Poe from Duke Energy, who will speak next to give us, or after them, to give us a sense as to the utilities perspective on EV charging. So Kevin and Josh, I'm not sure who's going first, but whoever is, it looks like Kevin, if you could kick us off.
Sure, that'd be great. Well, thank you all. Appreciate all the comments thus far. I will try and breeze through my slides so that we can get right into the interesting moderated discussion. And I can guarantee you that I'll speed through the first two at the very least. So I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy for ChargePoint. ChargePoint is a leading provider of EV charging hardware and software. We're working to create the new fueling network to move all people and all goods on electricity. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about how we're planning to do so and why it's so important. So to get past the preaching to the choir slides, if we could go to the next two. So no major industry is going to have more changes, as you're all probably already very aware. And if we could hit the next slide. Then the transportation sector, we're going to see a huge amount of growth in the available vehicles out there. And so the question is, how do we make sure we can have a well-coordinated approach from a policy and regulatory perspective so that we take advantage of the most amount of value and interest in the market to get infrastructure in for as little cost as possible and to provide the greatest public and economic and jobs created value. So if we could hit the next slide, please. So I think what Dale hinted at was it's more than just a question of what hardwares and connectors we need in order to support transportation electrification. ChargePoint provides software connected solutions. Our software-defined charging hardware is designed internally and includes options for every charging scenario, from home to multifamily to workplace, parking, hospitality, retail, and otherwise. And in order to provide a comprehensive experience that's good for the driver, that's good for the owner and operator of the charging station, we need to make sure that all of our infrastructure is fully integrated both into automotive platforms, right? So that you're able to connect app-based infrastructure access to in-dash screens, that we have seamless transactions with the chargers themselves, that we can connect to other distributed energy resource management systems at the home, so we can take advantage of the extent to which charging can be an asset to the grid. And then also thinking about, well, what are the things that are already happening? For example, on the fleet side, fleet operators have existing systems, fuel card practices in place. How do we make sure that we're supporting software and hardware that fully integrates into that to take advantage of those types of pieces? And these are steps that ChargePoint's taking, and we, with a lot of our competitors out there, are creating seamless roaming, so that if you don't have a ChargePoint card, you can use your EV box card on a ChargePoint station, and vice versa, just to make it as easy as possible for folks to make the switch to electric. If we could go to the next slide. So the way that a ChargePoint system is set up is such that we have a wide open network, so that you're able to connect any system to our network, that we're able to communicate openly, and that you're able to configure and manage that charging effectively, whether it's a question of making sure that the utility and the independent owner and operator are able to have an open partnership and manage charging effectively, whether it's a question of making sure that the folks who install EV charging infrastructure can effectively communicate with drivers to let them know that their charging is complete. We want to make sure that there is, again, that seamless integration, the full support for drivers, enabling folks to drive from any system and to be able to connect and pay for infrastructure access however they prefer. If we could go to the next slide. There's already been a lot of talk about the exciting actions last week from the legislature, but this is a topic that a previous session of the stakeholder group covered, looking specifically into why it's so important to have all the full pricing tools available, so that public entities, businesses are able to fully account for the amount of energy that's being used in a charging session. And by enabling both the public and private operators of charging stations to set prices that include an energy component, how much that price is per kilowatt hour, you really create flexibility to support private investment and public sector investment in charging along highway corridors and fleet depots, and in publicly accessible community locations as well. And having those tools in place, and having the right software in place, is what's going to help tee up investment and participation in the market by a wide variety of use cases. So if we could hit that last slide, which is next. There are almost limitless ways in which folks can provide access to charging. It's not just a question of, is there a standalone single business model or operating case for charging? ChargePoint, by and large, doesn't own any of the chargers on our network. Rather, those are owned and operated independently, and those can provide value either for the single-family homeowner to lower their fuel costs, to fleet operators who can have a variety of benefits from, again, lowering fuel costs or having predictability, managing expenses, looking at workplaces, multifamily housing, commercial property, parking, retail, and hospitality all have unique interests and needs in providing charging primarily as an amenity, but also as a value add aspect of their own internal, either public or private models. And I think having all the right tools in place, making sure that policymakers are aware of and leverage that independent investment and the need for those places who are investing in infrastructure to have a valuable relationship with drivers is ultimately going to be best for the driver. It's going to help put more chargers in the ground and will ensure a long-term sustainability of the market. I did want to make 2 points quickly. ChargePoint updates.
Kevin, if I could just interrupt you, if you could hold those points for the discussion, just so we can keep things rolling for time. We're going to go ahead and move to Josh right now because we're just falling behind on the schedule. So hold those points. We'll come back to them when we get into the moderated discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Stan.
If I can now introduce Josh Cohen from Greenlots. Josh, go ahead.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you to the Energy Office for having us and for including Greenlots in this discussion. I lead policy and regulatory engagement in South Carolina and a bunch of other states for Greenlots. So if you can go to the next slide. This is just the one slide about Greenlots. We are an EV charging software and solutions company. We have a whole range of types of customers, from local and state governments to commercial and industrial property owners and businesses to fleets, everything from light duty taxi cab fleets to heavy duty freight haulers to electric utilities. And we also work with automotive OEMs. Our core product is software to manage charging. We can do that by selling smart networked charging stations to customers. We can do the full turnkey installation. We can provide just the software management platform on the back end to manage charging. And we can also provide forward-facing solutions. For instance, we're working with Ford Motor Company to develop the EV charging integration into the Ford Pass app. We were founded 10 years ago. We're based in Los Angeles. And 2 years ago, we were purchased by Shell. So we're now a wholly owned subsidiary of Shell Renewables and Energy Solutions. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on a few key themes, and I'm going to just cover the highlights, Stan, so that we can have a good discussion afterwards. The single biggest takeaway I hope you come away with from this is, if you are thinking about buying charging stations, plan ahead, collaborate early and often with everyone who is going to have a decision touch point in this process. If you are buying chargers for your own vehicles, that means think about charging and the vehicles at the same time. Don't let one be the afterthought for the other. Regardless of your use case, whether it's for your own fleet or for publicly available charging, one of the biggest reasons for delays that our customers experience has to do with the local zoning and permitting. So a strong encouragement is to reach out, understand the local zoning laws, understand the permitting requirements, involve the permitting officer or whoever the reviewer is going to be in your conversations early while they're still preliminary. Everything from if you have a particular business that requires X number of parking spaces per square foot, if you dedicate 2 or 4 EV charging spaces, are those considered part of the required spaces, or are those in addition to? Do you have ADA requirements? Does the slope of the ground support those requirements? Do your setbacks allow electrical equipment in the setbacks? So all of these things, as you can imagine, can be major hangups down the road unless they're addressed and thought through upfront. In my 2 remaining minutes, Stan, I'm going to breeze through a couple quick messages. One builds on Kevin's presentation as well as Ben's presentation from earlier about the importance of including software upfront. And so a common theme that I have is all about future flexibility. It's not just about purchasing the equipment so that it works today, but making sure it still fits with your needs 5 years and 10 years down the road. So purchasing smart stations up front not only allows visibility into how those stations are being used, but it ultimately allows you, if you're the owner operator, to manage the charging, to manage electricity costs, to manage who has access, how much who pays, who gets to charge for free, how to integrate it with your fleet and the duty cycles, all of that. You need software for it. And then related to software is open standards. And Kevin also touched on this in his presentation. One of the biggest considerations if you're a customer purchasing charging stations is the OCPP communication standard, Open Charge Point Protocol. That's the communication between the software and the hardware so that they can speak the same language. And that enables you, to basically avoid vendor lock-in and not have a stranded asset if you want to switch software providers down the road. Our Southeast Regional Territory Manager told me last week that she has 3 existing deals going on where the customers are doing a full rip and replace, either because the stations originally installed were dumb stations or because they were smart stations, but they don't truly support OCPP interoperability. And so those are my main themes. The final point is you don't have to go this alone. Lean on companies who've been there, who've done this, and can be a resource. Thanks.
Great, Josh. Thank you very much. Appreciate the continuing insights. And for some more, we're going to turn now to Jim Polk with Duke Energy to get a utility perspective now that we've heard a little bit from a manufacturer and from the EVSE companies themselves. Jim, why don't you speak a little bit from how Duke is approaching the infrastructure challenge?
Sure. Why don't we jump to the next slide, because I know I'm tight on time here. A quick introduction. My name is Jim Polk, Duke Energy Electric Transportation Manager, responsible for accelerating adoption of EVs in the state of South Carolina. I have similar folks in other service territories, and the first thing I wanted to get across is the good news that there's a lot of momentum going on in this industry with the utilities, particularly in South Carolina. Last year, we approved a $9 million residential and DC fast charge pilot for South Carolina, which I am actively working on. And the fun thing doing is actually deploying DC fast chargers across our service territory, 60 stations at 30 sites. Since then, North Carolina, largest in the state at the time, largest in the Southeast at the time, $25 million, bigger thing, more comprehensive, but including 160 public level 2 and 40 DC fast chargers. Florida, who had already completed a 500 charging station deployment just recently, within the last couple of weeks, not a pilot, not something that is temporary, but part of the rate case, got approved 100 fast charging network, additional fast charging networks, as well as a broad array of rebates. So the really good news is that the infrastructure is being deployed and it's moving in the right direction, which is more and more. Next slide. Actually, if you could keep clicking there. Yeah, keep clicking just toward the end. Excuse me. All right, so what I tried to accomplish with that slide is electric vehicle charging equipment is really just the tip of the iceberg. Previously, when folks are looking at, hey, how do I go ahead and get set up? I'm just going to go out and buy an EV and buy the charging station. The reality is that tip of the iceberg ties into, well, are you ready with your facility infrastructure? Is the local utility ready to provide? And then lastly, as things change in the industry, how is your energy source going to be? All of these things kind of reiterates Josh Cohen's, meaning you got to plan early, you got to plan often with your electric utility. What I would say, when we're looking at, what's out there, are there going to be any challenges? Well, yes and no. When somebody buys a Tesla or a ID4 like I have, you buy the charging stations, a 240 thing, 240 connection, nobody's going to notice the difference. The utilities, it's a blip. Same thing even with, let's say, some workplace, some commercial public level 2, kind of same situation. And actually, I was talking to our installer last week, and I said, hey, what about some of these large networks that are putting in like 12 stalls at a time? And he said, well, from the substation capacity, we're actually pretty well suited there. Also, really hasn't been a problem so far. But when I look at Dale Hill's 1.5 megawatt charger, it's like, oh, wow, no, that's different. When I look at 20 buses being added on, or let's say a last mile a delivery company that has a fleet, well, that's when you get into challenges. That's when you get into, okay, plan early, plan often, get us in with you right away. So what happens when you do? And Stan, just to let you know, I'm sticking with just this slide because I know we're tight on time. But let me just quickly get into, what do you do when you want to add add to the thing. You do a site assessment. We'll come on, we'll say, hey, where is the power in relation to where you want to charge? Do you have access to 3-phase power? Do you have access to 480 volt? And if so, or if you are able to do that, how much is it going to cost to get it there? All those things have to be taken into consideration, and with some early planning, given some time, the grid is ready, and the grid is ready to add your business. Anyways, that's what we have, and as a matter of time, I'll hold it from there.
Great, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. So let's use some time that we have left, and we'll try to pick up minutes as we go through the rest of the day here. But I want to open up some time for discussion now. We've had some questions come in the chat, and I'll try to hit on what we can, and then we'll come back at the end with the discussion period at the back end to talk more about this. But one question, you know, when in talking with what everybody spoke to, from Dale with medium heavy duty all the way through, you know, the different EVSE companies and the utilities engagement and the sort of reference to both stranded assets in the past, but also the need for really careful planning and future proofing going forward. I'd like to speak a little bit more about the notion of interoperability and how in this time when standards are still settling out, when use cases are varied between light, medium, and heavy duty, what can be done today to ensure that charging stations that are deployed have long-term interoperability and are going to be able to service light, medium, and heavy duty use cases going forward?
Stan, I have a thought on that. The thing that really jumped out on interoperability, we actually, you know, made decisions on hardware, and we selected several vendors that we're going to go with. And it's one thing to say that you're interoperable. It's one thing to say that you align with OCPP. The big question is has the hardware and the network software been validated on the equipment? And we found sometimes that can be different. Someone could say, yeah, this is OCPP capable, but then you go out in the field and you do run into some different issues. So, you know, our experience has it been tested and validated, and actually maybe even been out in the field quite a bit. That's just the first thing that just jumped out at my mind when you talk about that.
Sure. Josh, did you have thoughts on that to share? And then Kevin?
Sure. So related to Jim's point, I would say focus on the software management platform first, which may seem self-serving because Greenlat's core product is software. But to Jim's point, Greenlat's has a validation lab in California, or an innovation lab, we call it, where we test and validate different makes and models of charging station to actually make sure that all of the, you know, commands and communications that are part of the OCPP protocol actually work as planned, and that you don't have problems when you actually have it installed in the ground. And so not every EV charger that, you know, may say it's OCPP compatible actually is. So start with the software first, and then find out what hardware makes and models support that. It actually gives you a lot more flexibility to customize the different chargers for your different needs. And from Greenlat's point of view, like, we're always updating that list, and we have a whole list of different products that we're validating in this quarter and the next quarter, et cetera. So it's a very dynamic list. But just at a very, you know, foundational point, start with a software-enabled device. Dummy stations have their use. I don't want to be dismissive of them, but if we're talking about deploying stations with any size and you want the ability to incorporate them in any sort of managed charging program or control system down the road, you need to have that firmware built in that can then support a software platform.
Great, thanks, Josh. Kevin, what are your thoughts on the value and importance of interoperability for folks who are looking at investing in charging infrastructure?
I think it's a great question. It's incredibly important. And it's also incredibly important to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. I once spent at the Department of Energy 8 hours debating what we meant by interoperability when we're trying to establish interoperability standards in a stakeholder working group. So we could mean, network to network interoperability where drivers are roaming between networks. We could mean station to network interoperability. We could mean the hardware connectors themselves. We could mean energy management. For example, OpenADR 2.0 is an internationally accepted standard for shedding load, and making sure that you've got the capabilities for the utility to communicate that kind of request to the owner or operator of a charger is really important. When we think about one of the issues that Stan, we've been talking about is to what extent has infrastructure come into the ground. I think Ben mentioned ERA-funded programs. I think it is challenging when you have infrastructure go in that's fully subsidized and that there's no local matching investment. You're not going to have investment by that entity in making sure it's on and up to date. So when we think about what are the tools that we have in place, I'd agree with Josh. It's important to have software as a baseline. There needs to be network capabilities. And full disclosure, ChargePoint makes network stations because we think that functionality both to the driver and to the operator of the charging station are really important. I think one of the things that's important, though, at the same time is making sure that we're flexible about, at this stage, the types of requirements or mandates that we put in place as to which specific method of communication we're putting in place. The last thing that anyone wants to do is artificially put a ceiling on the types of functionality that we can have between hardware, software, and operators. So I think that there's evolving protocols and discussion. Open ChargePoint protocol, if we're talking about that, which version are we talking about? Are we talking about the one that's put out by a nonprofit entity out in Europe, or are we talking about the version that's under consideration by the IEC, an international standards making organization? So it's a complex topic. It's an important one, and we could have an entire stakeholder workshop just talking about it. So I hope we'll be able to give that full consideration over the next few sessions.
Absolutely. I think for the purpose of this conversation, I think it's really good for folks listening to understand that there are complex issues to address when planning for infrastructure, but within that complexity is a richness of opportunity to find what works and what works well. And I think, Dale, if you want to have last word on this from the sort of medium heavy duty space where you're seeing a lot of, integration with electric utility grid and challenges of the sort of the large capacity demands of those vehicles. Just a closing thought on kind of where standards are at and how, if you're a transit agency today, or if you're a school bus procurement group today, can you confidently purchase the equipment and purchase the infrastructure and know that what you're buying is going to be good long term?
Well, yes, to a limited ability, I can speak to that. We are vertically integrated, and we're selling a complete system. So everything that we are providing interrelates to each other. All the equipment is built to all the necessary IEEE, EPRI, any of the SAE, any of the standards that are required. But first of all, we sit down before we do anything, we sit down with the utility and make sure that we're talking the same language and that we're going to be interoperable with their system before we ever start doing any engineering work or placing any equipment. But it is a pretty big basket of things that you're pulling together when you're doing a fleet. On the other hand, we have to make sure that our equipment is operable with other manufacturers' buses. And in the transit industry, the different bus manufacturers have worked together to make sure that we are using common communication language so that we can be interoperable with different manufacturers' equipment. In this early stages of transit, we have a number of customers that are buying buses from various vendors so they can do a shootout, so to speak, between vehicles. But once again, you can only afford to put in one set of infrastructure. So you have to be able to talk to the different buses. And of course, you have to be able to talk to the utility company.
Stan, if I could just add one other thing that we didn't get to, when we're talking about interoperability, if we're talking about that, I just think it's really important that we don't forget about consumer protection and security issues. Those are sometimes left to the side. Making sure that things are, payment card industry compliant is as important, if not more. And having a correct cybersecurity protocols in place and making sure that, whatever pieces are being considered on the communications protocols front, that we're ensuring that level of security is as important a consideration. Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I put that out there.
Thanks, Kevin. And clearly we can talk about the nuances of infrastructure all day long. And I think what it does is I think highlight the point that many have made, that planning is critical to this process. And so let's go ahead and shift gears. Thank you, Josh, Jim, Kevin, and Dale. We'll come back in the end with some more Q&A. But for now, let's go ahead and shift to talk to some folks who have done the work of getting projects in the ground and talk about some of their case studies. We're gonna talk to James Keel from the city of Greenville about public transit, Jim O'Leary from NIF Industries about fleet electrification, Christina Fortin from Commercial Tire about workplace charging, and Duncan Cannon from Cortland about multifamily charging. So thanks for the infrastructure panel. And let's go ahead and shift over to James Keel with the city of Greenville. Go ahead and let's hear about the public transit project.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm only about 5 minutes, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. And what you can see here, we've got a fleet right now of 4 Proterra buses, same buses that Dale is representing, and we've got 4 60 kilowatt chargers, so kind of previous generation charger here. So these rolled out April of 2019. So we've had them now for over 2 years. I'm using them here in Greenville. It's been an interesting process adapting from diesel, but I'm happy to say we're planning on buying 6 more here in the next 18 months. So I've been pretty pleased with the product and are moving in that direction. Next slide. So this right here is our bank of chargers. So there's 4 60 kilowatt chargers here, 240 kilowatts in total. Each of our vehicles is a 440 kilowatt bus. It very much varies. The first question that we get is how far can we run with them? And it really depends on the time of year. So what we see, if you move to the next slide, you've kind of got 3 factors that ultimately affect how far the bus is going to go. You've got the driver, you've got the terrain, and then you've got outdoor ambient temperature. And that has been the biggest factor that we can't control, obviously, is outdoor temperature. But whenever we get below about 40 degrees, get into the 30s, we're talking about losing several hours off of run time versus what we see in the summer and in the fall and spring. Next slide. We also use another really cool tool, is Vibracity. They're a European company, but they're based here in Greenville as well. And the nice thing about this is, just as you have telematics with all our vehicles, there's also telematics that you also see with electric vehicles that give you information about, what kind of emissions they're saving / producing, net result, and at the same time, how that vehicle is performing. So this ties into the J1939 information system on the bus, and we can actually get rich data to find out, how outdoor ambient temperature is affecting things, how the driver is affecting performance that day, and at the same time understanding how much power is generated. But it's also pretty useful in understanding, how charged the bus is, what the range is, and knowing when to swap it out. We provide 18 hours of service a day. This bus will not last for 18 hours. If we're lucky, it'll last about half the service day. So the dispatch can actually sit in here and watch, what the performance is and know when to swap that vehicle out. Next slide. Just another slide that kind of shows you some of the reports that we can run on a daily, weekly, yearly basis to understand what kind of CO2 and NOx results there are from running these vehicles. Great reporting, great for grant writing, but from the environmental side, we can actually understand really what's going on with each individual vehicle. And I'll move to the last slide, which is my last slide that actually has kind of takeaways. We've boiled it all down. I've spoken at several of these, and really, things that we've been hearing all morning. One, pick a partner. This is bleeding edge technology. Anybody that tells you that we have electric vehicles figured out is lying to you. It is very much bleeding edge. The technology is developing very quickly. We've certainly experienced that. But understanding who your partner is can make this transition a lot easier. Partner with your utility early. As Dale was talking about, it's important to know about how much power is in the area. The same thing that Jim with Duke was talking about. Know what your capabilities are and give them a heads up. If there might be upgrades that need to be done to the area, especially with larger vehicles. We're building a new facility and we're looking at putting in a 1.5 megawatt charger. So making sure that that's doable there is very important. Work with your manufacturer. Proterra is a great partner. Whenever we were looking at this initially, they actually came in and studied our routes and looked at terrain and mileage to figure out, which vehicles we actually needed to deploy to make it work. So there's just some really good value with understanding what your system is and what it looks like. Invest in a good warranty and invest in good training. These buses break just like anything else. Don't assume that because it's electric that it's not going to break. They do break and they are just as expensive, if not more expensive to fix. So keep that in mind. Same thing is true with training. We've got mechanics. They've worked on diesel engines for 20 or 30 years. And it's scary for people, right? They told me whenever we first got them, I can go put my hand in the back of a running diesel engine and I might lose my hand, I might lose my arms, but I'm most likely going to live. I touched the wrong wire on a bus and I'm going to die. So, it's kind of a grim outtake, but you can't beat investing in good training and making people feel really comfortable with the technology and understanding how it works. And the last thing I'll just say is expect a learning curve. Anytime you start this deployment, it's scary. You don't know really what to do, and especially whenever you're one of the first people to do it. But at the end of the day, there's a big community out there that can help you and just understand that you're not going to know everything walking into it. So I will leave it there. My last slide is just my contact information if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out. Thanks.
Thank you, James, and yeah, congratulations on the good work of GreenLink to date, and yeah, look forward to watching the progress. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jim O'Leary now to talk about EV infrastructure use cases and fleet electrification. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'll give a little background to who NFI is, and then talk a little bit about our use cases and just leave you with some high level thoughts that I'm going to sound like a broken record compared to everybody else. So NFI is it's a family-owned North American logistics company. We operate about 4,000 trucks throughout the country. We have over 50 million square foot of warehousing and did about 2.5 billion in revenue last year. So when you look at what we're doing in the electric space, and you can move forward to the next slide, and you can go forward one more. There we go. When you look at what we're doing, we've definitely been on the bleeding edge of all of this, and it's because we believe in a sustainable future, but we also believe that we have a lot of use cases that kind of fit electrification sweet spot. The first project that we're involved in, we are currently running 10 Class 8 Freightliner e-Cascadias in Southern California. We've been running those. They kind of trickled in since September of 2019. We have over 300,000 all EV miles in that fleet, servicing the ports of LA and Long Beach. The next project that we are involved in is the Volvo Lights project. In the beginning part of this year, we received our first 2 Volvo Lights trucks. And then Green Lots is also a partner in that project. That is the same use case as the trucks the Daimler trucks that we're running, servicing the ports of LA and Long Beach. But that project also has yard horses involved. It has electric forklifts involved. It has solar involved. So that's a project that's been talking about electrifying the entire supply chain. And then the other thing we did in Southern California was we electrified the majority of our yard horses that are out there. We electrified 25 yard horses with the Kalmar Ottawa T2Es. To move into the infrastructure that supports these trucks, it's a little bit different in each. And the other thing I would say is that it's also a lot of capital to make this investment as well, but I'll get there. The infrastructure we have for the 10 e-Cascadias, we have 5 150 kilowatt ABB chargers supporting those 10 trucks. For the Volvo trucks, which will eventually be 4 Class 8 Volvos, we have 2 150 kilowatt ABB chargers with 4 dispensers, and then the Kalmar Ottawas, they kind of come with their own charger, and it is a dummy charger, but the truck is smart and able to give us data. So the one thing that, when we talk about, and this is what everybody has said so far, gone are the days when we're talking about EVs in its current state or even the very near future. Gone are the days where I'm the truck guy, I'm the asset manager, I'm the purchasing guy in a fleet, that I'm negotiating with the OE, and we come up with a truck price, and then 6 months later, I have 100 trucks delivering to my fleet, 10 a month. Those days are gone when we're talking about EVs. They are big projects that have year-plus lead times that involve multiple different departments in our organization. Never before was the legal group, the IT group, the finance group, all involved in the purchasing of the vehicle and the real estate and all of these folks that now have a stake in EVs. And to one specific example about, the lead time of these projects, I remember when we sat down and we went through, the purchasing of the Daimler vehicles, we thought we were ahead of the game. We were sitting down with the utility. It was probably pre-Thanksgiving of 2018, and we invite SCE, SoCal Edison, out to our site to do a site visit, and they laid out a timeline that was, way past when we were expected to receive the first vehicles. And that was an eye-opening moment for all of us involved in the projects that, this is a different game than we've been used to before. And they're expensive. I'll go back to that. It's not cheap. That Daimler project for 5 chargers, the engineering, the construction of that site, that was an $800,000 site, right? And now you start thinking about incentives and ways to incentivize to throw a carrot out there for fleets to want to do these projects. I think, with some of the programs that exist in California today that are starting to be adopted in other parts of the country, the SoCal Charge Ready program was the first, I think, the trailblazer in that front, where, they will pay for all of the upgrades needed to your site, the construction of your site up to the point of the charger. But there's some headwinds in that incentive program that fleets like ourselves, don't really care for. And a lot of that has to do with the time commitment that you need to make to the utility to make sure that that site is fully operational. One of the things as a fleet that we looked at, we're often in a 3 to 5 year contract with our customers, right? So you now need to make this decision to electrify together. And if you have a utility or entity out there that's giving you funding for it, they may want a commitment more than 3 to 5 years. So what do those types of things look like?
James, sorry to interrupt, but just I really appreciate what you said so far. And if you could just wrap up so we can transition to Christy, that'll be great.
Sure. You know, the only other thing I'll say, and I'll end with this thought, and it was similar to some of the comments earlier, is that, you know, as a fleet, we're so concerned with the truck that we often overlook the infrastructure, right? And that is one mistake that we made in our first project, where we're worried about the uptime of the truck. We're worried about the reliability of the truck, but you've got this other asset of the infrastructure that you need to invest just as much time in to make sure that you're doing all those things that were pointed out by ChargePoint and Greenlots earlier, and making sure you're investing in software and those types of things. So as an early adopter, heed their advice, and make sure that you're looking at those things with the software, making sure it's OCPP compatible, all those things. And that's it.
Great, James. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing insights from the left coast here to South Carolina. A lot to learn from experiences there. And to continue on that theme of learning from experience, I'll turn it over to Christy Fortin to talk about workplace charging.
Yep, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
All right, so we want to talk a little bit about just the charger that we got in our area and why we decided to do it. Just a little background on Continental Tire, not much. We are a global company, and we are all over the automotive industry, all over different parts of the automotive industry. And our particular division is based in Sumter, South Carolina for our plant. And that's part of the tire division. And at this plant, we make passenger and light truck tires exclusively. And one of the new additions we just put on has to do specifically with tires for electric vehicles. So if you go to the next slide. So we didn't put in a lot of electric charging stations right away, but we were in the middle of a plant expansion in early 2019, and we knew we needed a bigger parking lot. So one of the things we looked at was what's our future going to look like, and what are our future customers going to be? So we knew at the time that several employees owned electric cars, and we did not have a charger, and they're not really prevalent in our area. We knew that one of our customers for this new electric car centric tire, which is our Conti silent process, was Tesla. So they had an interest in electric cars for sure. And we knew that we're looking at other potential OEMs, which is original equipment manufacturers for electric vehicles. So this Conti Seal, Conti silent process, we'll be trying to get that on more vehicles as time goes by, especially from the original equipment standpoint. Next slide. All right, so the Conti Seal, Conti silent process, we did groundbreaking back in March 2019. And what it is a noise reduction technology that involves an application of polyurethane foam to the inner liner, which absorbs the interior noise. And so Conti silent reduces the sound of road noise by approximately 9 decibels. Now, if you've got a car with an engine, you're not going to notice that. But if you've got an electric car, you definitely notice that. So this Conti Seal technology is developed specifically for damaged tread, and it'll seal itself. But just to let you know what that is, kind of a side note, because what we're talking about here is the electric vehicles. Now, if you just click one more time, I think it's going to show you a picture of the expansion that we put in specifically for that. And that is an enrichment process where they apply that treatment for the Conti Seal or Conti Silent to the tires that we make here on site. Next slide. Here's a picture of what that looks like. So I don't really have a lot there other than we took if you build it, they will come attitude, and not all employees have electric cars by any stretch of the imagination, but now it's pretty regular that you see people using it in the parking lot. And what we did was we opted for a charger that took a little bit longer to charge because of our shift pattern here. So employees, they come in, they can plug in, and by the end of their shift, they're ready to go. That's all I have.
Well, Thank you, Christy. It's really exciting. I know that, you know, there's a lot of data that speaks to how important workplace charging is to encourage adoption, and that folks who have access to workplace charging are much more likely to adopt electric vehicles. So it's a big deal to get that workplace charging in place. So well done. We're going to go ahead and shift to Duncan Cannon now from Cortland to talk about use case in multifamily dwellings. Go ahead, Duncan.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I appreciate the time for being on here. And I think the guests have really summed up a good idea of how to get this stuff implemented. But a little background on Cortland. We have about 65,000 units across the United States, over 200 communities, and we have about 20% of those communities have EV chargers installed. And what I do at Cortland is I coordinate the strategy for our building systems, which include access control, package loggers, cameras, but also EV charging. Really, the big question is kind of how and when do you actually get this infrastructure installed? Traditionally, multifamily trails behind single family ownership for EVs. But with kind of this increased demand, prices coming down for vehicles, there's a lot more multifamily ownership and apartment ownership of these EVs. So we're trying to make sure we are out in front of that. But again, it's hard to gauge where the demand is because it's more of a binary solution for an EV owner. If they are looking for an apartment and there are no EV stations, then that crosses you off the list fairly quickly. So we are afraid we're missing the EVs owners that could possibly rent in our communities. So going through that, it's you know, how do you actually get this installed is a little bit more difficult. And I think Jim Keel's takeaways said it best, is really you need to find a partner, and it's choosing where everything is, and how to get installed, and then how you maintain all that equipment becomes very important. For Cortland, we have new developments which are easier to plan for because they have, you know, a much longer lead time. You know, they're not going to be delivered for 2 years, but really then the question is, how much future flexibility do you plan to put in? What is your desired capacity? So all that planning is important. But then we also have all of our existing communities. It's really, how do you then choose? We go through and analyze the data on how much EV ownership we have at our communities, and then start targeting where we need to begin first. But to complicate things, you know, we are an acquisition-based company, and if we acquire a community that already has EV chargers, it's how do we roll that into our kind of existing management of those, because there are so many different products out there, lots of vendors, lots of ways to get it done. And the question is, if it's a dumb charger there, how do you then get it to be online? Just going back high level, really, it starts in the planning and the coordination and visibility on these decisions with all the stakeholders. Again, I think Jim Keel said it right. There's a huge learning curve where we're internally educating our investment and operations teams as to why we're making this decision, and kind of why these budgets are necessary. Because again, if these installs weren't budgeted for, it's a lot harder to get them approved. But moving forward, it's, you know, do you then choose to put in stations with an intent on getting a return on your investment? Which means, are you going to charge these residents, or are you not? If you're doing so, if you put in a connected station, there's a lot more maintenance involved, and there's a lot more of a connectivity, software as a service fee. And all those things need to be factored in there. Because again, if we install EV chargers at a site and we only have one EV owner, that's not really a good model for getting a return on investment. But you have to plant those seeds. You have to build it first, and then kind of increase awareness, because we can convert residents who are already there, if they now feel comfortable owning an EV because there's a station there. It's all the more important. With that, with multifamily, you're not going to electrify the entire site. So then it's the site choice as to, do you locate it somewhere where everyone can use it, or do you try to distribute your infrastructure across the site? Again, with equipment choice, we have a multiple choices as to what's out there. We had infrastructure that was installed 5 years ago that is looking like it's approaching end of life. We've got connected chargers that the modems are 3G and going out of their life cycle, so they need to get updated. So it's a lot more decisions in the process to keep moving forward. But yeah, so it's really building out the internal team and then finding a partner to be able to execute, install, plan with you in order to optimize your sites. But I guess I'll leave it there and leave it open to questions.
Well, it's really insightful, Duncan, and appreciate kind of the work you all are doing, really leaning into the multifamily space, because it's, critical from a driver's perspective to have access to home charging if you're going to really be able to benefit from the economic savings of driving electric vehicles. And multifamily dwellings are also critical for making sure that EV ownership is equitable and accessible to all, including those who don't own their own home. So thank you for that push. And so let's, in the name of time, what I suggest is let me go ahead and give this regional context quickly, and then let's come back around to a Q&A. We've got stuff that's been coming in to the chat, and then we can have a Q&A that talks about both the sort of technology piece that we've talked about, but also kind of these use cases specifically, especially with the multifamily family and workplace charging. So if everyone's okay with that, let's go ahead and jump into this regional context. I'll go through these slides, and then we'll get to Q&A. So I'm going to take my moderator hat off for a moment and speak about what's happening here across the Southeast situation to situate South Carolina in the region. So you can go ahead to the next slide. One thing that's really important to be paying attention to that really underscores this entire conversation is that the industry is growing rapidly, and you can watch sort of the current growth and kind of see the forthcoming growth by watching the investment that's flowing globally to support electric transportation, and specifically here in the Southeast, where a significant amount of that capital is landing in order to transition to electric vehicle production, but also to support charging infrastructure companies and supply chain companies that are opening up shop here in the region. Next slide. Across the country, one thing I want to point out with this slide is that, the market continues to grow. There's a lot of information on this slide, but the one thing I want to draw your attention to are the last two bars, which were Q3 and Q4 of 2020. And you can see how quickly EVs rebounded in the pandemic and the economic challenges that we've all been experiencing. In Q4 in 2020, EV sales tied the second best quarter performance historically. So EVs are showing a lot of resilience, which is really good to see. You can also see in this graph, the blue in the bars represent Tesla sales. So you can see how much Tesla is dominating the market right now with those longer range vehicles. And as OEMs come out with longer range vehicles, you can imagine the growth that we're going to see as those products become available from the passenger vehicle side. Next slide. We work with Atlas Public Policy at Southern Alliance for Clean Energy to track metrics from the Southeast, and these are a little bit old now. We'll be coming out with our 2021 report on the Southeast. But what I want to draw your attention to is the disproportionate amount of investment and job creation that's coming to the Southeast to support electric transportation. Those those investments are critical to not only building out jobs here in the region, but also supporting on the federal level the Biden administration's desire to see infrastructure investment come from American-made companies. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is for utility investment and government funding, these numbers have changed. There's increased utility investment and increased government funding, but it still trails what's happening across the country. And what we see nationwide is where governments are leaning in and where utilities are leaning in, the market is accelerating. Next slide. The other thing to take note in the Southeast is that, you know, every state obviously is not having the same experience when it comes to sales. Some of this has to do with which states are more populous, but other has to do with different policies that are being put in place, such as the Georgia state tax credit that got put in place in around 2011 that drove up sales, which then plummeted when the tax credit went away. As well as Florida, which is one of Tesla's strongest market and seen strong growth in EVs despite a lack of good EV policy. So there's a lot going on in the Southeast that's driving these numbers, and what we want to see here in South Carolina is South Carolina as a state start to rise up in its EV sales. Next slide. So, a key takeaway that I just want to leave folks, with is that across the region, and we've heard this again and again in the presentation today, there's a tremendous amount of momentum. And that momentum's happening on the policy front, it's happening on the regulatory front. You're also seeing the impact of Volkswagen settlement funding being deployed in states, as well as EV planning, just like what's happening right now in South Carolina. The planning piece is, again, as we've heard today, really critical, starting at the state level, but then getting all the way down to the site level. So we're seeing activity across the region, and we expect it to grow over the next 36 months, especially as federal funding and federal policy starts to trickle down to the region. Next slide. One issue that is being felt in every state in the Southeast and not yet being solved adequately anywhere is the issue for equity and access. So when we think about transitioning to an electric transportation future, we want to not only replace cars, trucks, and buses with electric versions, but we also want to transcend the inequities and injustices the transportation sector has perpetrated and get to a place where there aren't underserved and overburdened communities any longer in the suffering from pollution and lack of access. And so electric vehicles have the ability to really transform, but we've got to plan accordingly. This picture of North Carolina just gives one example, and this is happening in every state, where the concentration of charging infrastructure and electric vehicle ownership is really happening around the metropolitan areas, and specifically in the wealthier zip codes within those metropolitan areas. So as we think about the makeup of the Southeast, which has vast rural communities, as well as significant issues with poverty and low to moderate income communities, is that we're looking at programs and policies that will make it so that everybody has access not only to electric transportation through school buses and transit, but that everybody has access to ownership of electric vehicles, as well as access to transit and school buses and their products being delivered by electric vehicles as well. So this is a challenge that South Carolina has an opportunity to lead on. There's a lot of work going on here, but it really is a sort of tip of the spear issue that needs to be addressed. And with that, I'll like to move us into Q&A for these remaining 20 minutes. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jen and Allie to go ahead and they've been watching the chat and let them go ahead and lead this Q&A session. So I'll pass it back over to you, Jen.
Fantastic, Stan. This has been an incredible webinar. Thank you for everyone who is on the panels today, for all of the great questions that are coming in. And actually, Stan, thank you for getting us back on track there. You have very good time management skills, so thank you for that. So we have a lot of great questions. I want to kick off one just to the entire group. Stan mentioned the Atlas public policy work, the studies that they've done, the reports that they've done. And what we've seen is that in order to reach 100% passenger EV sales by 2035, Atlas is estimating that we need $87 billion in charging station investment over the next decade. So given that, and given Biden's goal at the federal level for 500,000 charging stations, and states are starting to come up with their own goals, I'm curious what this group thinks that South Carolina specifically should be prioritizing to prepare for and take advantage of these huge EV infrastructure needs and the amount of investment it's going to take to get there. And I throw that out to anybody.
So Jen, this is Josh with Greenlots. So I have a two-part answer to that. One is when you say, how should South Carolina prioritize the investment? If you're talking South Carolina from a public policy standpoint, that's one thing. If you're talking private actors, that's another thing. I think, so let me just kind of briefly try and touch on both. From the private actor standpoint, there's a lot of reason today to go ahead and start that planning process. Whether, if you go back to Kevin's presentation from ChargePoint, he had a slide with a number of different reasons why a private, property owner or business may want to install EV charging as an amenity, as potentially a way to bring in more revenue if people spend more time in the convenience store, that sort of thing. And also for a fleet operator, I mean, we've heard just today several examples of how, the total cost of ownership piece can offer savings over the lifetime of a fleet. And that's why fleet operators are already in this process, whether it's light duty or even medium and heavy duty. So in terms of South Carolina as a whole, I think incentives to support private actors to help that transition make sense. But the second piece is for public charging, and this touches or kind of builds on Stan's last point about equity. The business case to deploy, own, and operate public charging stations at this stage in the market is really challenging. If the business model is to charge some premium on top of the electricity that you as the site host are paying for yourself and have that margin cover all of your costs of installation, ownership, operation, maintenance, and provide a return on the investment, I mean, that's super, super challenging. And I think one of the best ways that public policymakers can support this transition is to support public charging through a range of incentives, a range of investment models, leveraging local governments, leveraging electric utilities, leveraging other types of actors. Because there's a lot of talk about this chicken and egg, but I think it's more of a binary proposition where only until there's some base foundational level of charging infrastructure everywhere are we really going to see EV adoption take off. It's not enough if you have 1% of the population driving EVs and there's 1% of the charging infrastructure that's needed. If they grow in tandem, you need to reach a certain threshold. You need to have accessibility and availability in economically disadvantaged communities, in underserved rural areas. You need it across the board. And so in terms of a policy focus, I think that should be certainly one of the top priorities for any public policymakers at this time.
Great. Thank you, Josh, for that great answer. And yeah, so I guess it's more of a build it and they will come versus the chicken and egg, right? Right now we're at that point. Kevin, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to add something in?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I definitely appreciate where Josh is coming from. I think we come to a bit of a different conclusion. I don't ascribe to the Kevin Costner school of public policy. I do love Field of Dreams though. But yeah, I think it's important to take a breath and realize that we don't have to have all of the infrastructure necessary to support the EVs that will be on the road in 2050. We don't need to have all of that right now, let alone all the infrastructure, that we need for 2025 or 2030. I think identifying what are the ways that we can achieve that self-sustaining investment and avoid as many costs that are unnecessary as possible. So if we want to get to a certain level of penetration, both for private charging, where most charging takes place at home and at work, and for fleets, which fleets are incredibly important for equity considerations. But if we want to avoid costs, looking at how building codes are structured, how do we look at that from a planning perspective, so that if we avoid the need to break concrete as soon as new buildings are in place to drop in conduit and wiring, I think we can get there a lot faster. Ultimately, I think that there's going to be broad consensus, amongst the panelists here that we want to have more support for infrastructure. The question is, how do we do so at minimal cost to the public, both from a taxpayer and ratepayer perspective, and maximal benefit societally? So taking advantage of that interest, how do we make sure that we don't duplicate investments that might otherwise take place, and leverage as much value on the table as is already there?
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, a lot of coordination is definitely needed. And we've heard that throughout this webinar today, right? Just throughout the process, just coordination across the board. It seems to be paramount for what we're trying to do. Thank you, Kevin. Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I might jump in, and maybe Stan can help provide some context to this. But, we talked about utility involvement and funding for these programs. What has been the level of utility involvement in the region? Has it been, I know that Jim had mentioned, in California, I think PG&E had built, everything up until the charger behind the infrastructure to make things ready for that unit. So have we been seeing utilities really just doing it all in our region? Have they been making things ready, or have they, been owning and operating it, is, I guess, my kind of question here.
Well, just, Ben, I think there's a lot going on right now, and you've got it happening at the electric member co-op level, the municipal utility level, and the investor-owned utility level. So there's programs going on at all those levels. I think what we're seeing from the investor-owned utilities perspective is we're seeing growth in the level of engagement, and we're seeing utility commissions kind of wrestling with what is appropriate engagement for those electric utilities. And we're starting to see some, initial alignment among commissions happening in Florida and in North Carolina, and to a lesser degree in Georgia. But that process is going to be evolving as utility commissions respond to more and more public filings by the investor-owned utilities who are looking to engage and support the industry. There's a lot that's going to happen in that space. In the electric member co-op space, there's a lot of experimentation that's going on, which is really exciting to see. Like Roanoke Electric Co-op in North Carolina, that's moving in, testing some vehicle-to-grid technology right now, or like the Cox EMC in Georgia, that's doing a lot of work around incentivizing workplace charging and other charging installations through time of use rates, or what's happening down in Florida with the Orlando Utility Commission that's really pushing hard on supporting electric transit and fleet adoption in their territory in and around the greater Orlando area. So you're seeing a lot of different levels of activity right now, and I expect that we're going to see a lot more. But when you look at the total amount of utility engagement as measured through ratepayer dollars invested in electric infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and vehicle support, the Southeast still ranks down around 1% of total investment nationwide. So it pales in comparison to the level of utility engagement in the Northeast, some in the Mid-Atlantic, and certainly over on the West Coast.
Appreciate that. And then just to answer Jen's question about prioritization, I personally think our alternative fuel corridors that facilitate logistics and personal travel through the interstate network, and then additionally multi-unit dwelling, charging folks who don't have access to garages, I think are kind of priorities to focus on for infrastructure.
Great. Yes, thanks. Good points, Ben. And thank you, Stan. Nanette Edwards, I see you have your hand raised. So go ahead, ask your question.
And it's more of a comment than a question. One of the things I heard Stan talk about the level of investment made through the electric ratepayer. What I want to focus on is, as the Office of Regulatory Staff, obviously the Energy Office is facilitating this process, but I want to make sure everybody as part of this process knows and understands that ORS's mission before the Public Service Commission is to protect all customer classes and represent all all consumers, whether it's residential, industrial, commercial. And one of the concerns I have, and I'm just going to put it out there bluntly, is to me, there is a fundamental policy decision that has to be made. And I think it has to be made at the General Assembly. And that is, who pays? Is it the taxpayer? Is this a taxpayer-funded initiative where we convert and prepare for the electrification of the transportation sector? Or is this an electric ratepayer? Because today, I promise you that when our staff in consumer services is dealing with a consumer who's on the phone crying, saying that they can't pay their current electric bill, they don't understand or believe in any sense of the imagination that they're paying or should be paying for some sort of renaissance to change from where we are today into the future. What they think they pay for under our current statutes is literally what is necessary to generate that electricity, and that's their bill. So I think this can't just be in a vacuum. You can't have these residential customers sitting there thinking that they're just paying for what is necessary to turn, when they flip that light switch on, that's all they're doing, is they're paying for what does that. And at some point, I do think there's going to have to be this policy discussion of, who ultimately is going to pay. And maybe it's an answer of both. But I do feel that that has to be a decision made by our South Carolina General Assembly, and not just something where we go to a commission and put it to our Public Service Commission. We've done the pilot. Duke has a pilot that's going on right now, and certainly gathering intelligence and knowing how it impacts, or gathering information to be able to have a good discussion about this as we see EVs ramp up, which is exciting. I love the fact that the Energy Office is heavily involved in this and was very supportive of a process with PRT and ORS where 3 chargers were installed at 3 state parks. But I don't want to miss this opportunity to share with you one of the concerns is, as this moves forward from a policy perspective, that those residential customers in particular have a fundamental understanding. And if that's the way the policy goes, that's great, but it needs to get out there and be understood. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Nanette. And definitely, I'm glad you brought that up because, as we're talking about all of this, it is so important that who pays for it question. And I think you're absolutely right. As we go through this process, we need to be thinking about this in all of our working groups and what we're doing. I'm wondering, a couple of people raised their hand after this. Does anybody have a reaction to Nanette's kind of question or actually comment? Or do you have other questions? If you have a reaction, go ahead and speak up.
Yeah, this is Phil Jones. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Jen?
Go ahead, Phil. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just going to push back a little bit gently on Nanette. We run into this all the time across the country, and the issue is to determine the public policy of the state. I think Nanette's right. There's no question that the legislature and the governor lead the commission, that those policies should be set by those bodies. But it's important to remember 2 things. The commission has a lot of delegated authority from the legislature to do a lot of things. And I call it the regulatory toolbox. So there are many things that they can do within existing statute and rate design, frankly, to get things done. And then the other thing is a lot of these things are just in the rate making mode. So I would push back and say, there's a lot commissions can do. Of course, utilities have to prove that it's just and reasonable rates and that it's a prudent investment. The other thing is that there are lots of leverage sources of funding in the Southeast. So we have Florida turning around on, the governor has changed his beneficial mitigation plan to recognize more the role of EVs. I don't think South Carolina and some of the other states are doing that. So you have Volkswagen money. Sometimes you have city money, like Stan said. So if the utilities and all the stakeholders can leverage money, the cost benefit ratio, of course, increases. And we're looking to that for the federal infrastructure money coming as well. It will come to a variety of sources in the state, but if the utilities can weave that into their plan, all the better. The only other thing I'd say on rates, to Nanette's concern about affordability, of course, I'm a former commissioner and we are tremendously concerned about rates. And my colleagues, if I look my colleagues around the country over the past year and a half, they have been pounded by energy affordability advocates. So, and ORS is very concerned about this. So of course you're concerned about energy affordability. But if we drop the ball on this one, on beneficial electrification, we're really going to drop the ball. Because when you think about beneficial electrification, what is it? It reduces rates for consumers, right? So they're avoiding gasoline and diesel sales. And if we get the utility rates right, they're charging off peak. So they're saving money. The other thing is that it improves the grid. So grid utilization, that can be proved out in a rate case. And the third thing, and this is to Nanette's point, this could or could not be the public policy of the state, but it improves the environment. It provides positive environmental benefits. So kind of, if we don't get that concept of beneficial electrification, we're really missing the boat. The last thing I'd say on rates is Synapse has done a study. It hasn't been proven out in a general rate case. I understand that with litigation and all sorts of contention in a rate case, but Synapse has done a study of actual load profile data from the 3 California IOUs from 2013 to 2018. And it has shown that if you get off-peak charging right, if you can get consumers and bus operators, transit operators to charge at the right time, benefits go up and costs go down. And so the commission then can be, because the utility gets more revenue. So the utility and the commission decide how to allocate that revenue with rate spread and rate design. So we're hoping that that downward pressure on rates story gets out to states like South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. And is that Synapse report out, or did you say it's coming?
It's out and I can send it to the group. I can send it to you. It was done about 1.5 years ago.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, and I can distribute it out. Thank you. So we are running up on time. I see, Josh and Kevin, that you both have your hands raised. 30 seconds or less?
Sure. So 30 seconds or less. To Nanette's point, it's not just about cost, it's also about value. And if commissions and utilities take a hands-off approach in order to save a few bucks up front, we're looking at potentially significant and otherwise avoidable upgrades that will be required to the distribution infrastructure. If you think about one EV adding more or less about 1/3 to a typical household energy consumption, if a bunch of houses on a cul-de-sac all get EVs and charge up and it's not managed, the ratepayers are going to be the ones who pay for those distribution system upgrades. And just to tie that back into a specific example of a customer thinking about what sort of charging stations to purchase, again, that underscores the point that it's not just about cost, but it's also about what value are you going to get down the road. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And go ahead, Kevin. 15 seconds.
Just real brief. So per the legislation that passed last week, if it's signed, I think having that context for a conversation, both through ORS, through the commission and elsewhere, will be really critical. So I definitely appreciate Annette's point. I think, to what Josh and Phil said, it is complex, but it's not a question of yes or no. Should this be fully covered by ratepayers, or should it be should not involve utilities of all stripes. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be taken into consideration. Just how do we avoid unnecessary costs, and how do we take advantage of as much value as is already on the table? So I appreciate Annette's point, and thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you all. Yeah, you can see there's an area that, a few areas that we've uncovered today that need a lot more discussion. And I really appreciate all of the input and all of the discussion around it. There were some questions on the chat that we didn't specifically get to, although I want to thank Phil and David for both responding to some of those. We can kind of take some of those offline, especially vehicle to grid. I think somebody said this could be a whole nother webinar, and so perhaps we will do that. I think that might be a necessary thing, have another subject matter expert webinar. I'm 2 minutes over, so I appreciate you all sticking with us and spending the time. I really want to thank the panelists, every one of you for joining us today and for your unique perspectives. Thanks, Stan, for his excellent moderating as usual. Thank you, Stan, for keeping us all on track. And then to the Energy Office and the Office of Regulatory Staff, thank you so much for having this initiative, for bringing us all together. I hope you all have a great rest of your Monday and a great week. Thank you all for joining us. Bye.